Part 2. I don't know how long I stood there holding the remnants of Mr. Bear, staring at the yellowed cotton with growing dread as all of the memories poured into me like water from a broken sink faucet, but at some point my daughter hugged me. He's scary. It's amazing the impact 2 words can have on a father. I was still scared, especially remembering the 2 boys in the salt field and how my daughter was in between the ages the 2 of them had been. But there was something else, too. I was angry. Angry at Ed for not leaving my family out of it. Angry at Ed for messing with my little girl. I've never really stopped trying to figure Ed out, but there are always lulls. Long, maddening lulls. Fear of him always dies down eventually, and whenever he returns, all of it seems to hit me at once, as if it had been building up, waiting for him to return, somewhere below the thoughts that maybe he was just a bad dream after all. The fear and anger aren't the only things keeping me awake. We love animals, and have a number of different pets and critters around the house. Among them are a small pack of chihuahuas, half of them rescues. One of them, a 3-year-old Merle mix named Remy, barks at nearly everything and everyone he sees moving outside of the windows. He was abused before coming to live with us, and, though his barking is obnoxious and loud, we know it's because he just wants to keep us safe in his own way. It took a while, but we were able to sleep through it eventually. If the barking did wake me up in the wee hours, I would go take a late-night leak, bringing him back to our room with the rest of the pack, and fall asleep again within minutes. Up until a couple of weeks before I found Mr. Bear, his night barking had all but ceased. Since finding Mr. Bear, the barking startles me out of whatever level of sleep I have managed to achieve, head on a swivel as I peer into the shadows, dreading the moment that I will finally find Ed's sharp-toothed smile, or something worse, waiting for me in the dark. Fear, anger, and the need to protect my family. These are the things that make it hard to fall asleep at night. I think you can all understand the fear and the desire to protect my wife and daughter. Some of you, especially parents, will understand the anger. Even so, and it may be because of how much practice I've had at sleeping through the fear, I worry more about the animals than anything else, which is why it has become increasingly difficult to fall back asleep once Remy's barking wakes me up. To understand that, it's time for me to talk about Charlie the Catman and what happened to the cats in the trailer park. I haven't lived in as many places as most military brats have because my parents wanted us to have some sort of stability. Most of my moving around didn't happen until I was an adult. There is one thing I can say for nearly every city, hell, every neighborhood, that I have ever lived in. There is always someone with a mental disability walking around that everyone knows and no one understands. Someone who becomes almost mythical to the kids, who create stories about them to explain why they are the way they are, leaving the adults to shake their heads, though they usually don't know any more of the truth than the kids do. The town crazy is usually left alone, so long as they leave everyone else alone. Charlie the Catman didn't seem to believe in the last rule, and as such, every word out of his mouth was twisted by the adults of the trailer park to make him seem like more of a monster. One of the great things about living in a trailer park as a young kid was not having very far to walk between houses when fundraising. The first time I saw the inside of Charlie's house was an assault on the senses. I don't know if shows like Hoarding existed when I was young, but Charlie would have fit right into an episode of the show. He was an extreme cat hoarder, thus the nickname. I was walking door to door with a box full of chocolate bars. My mom was with me, but she would stand at the end of the driveway and let me walk up to the doors by myself. She told me not to expect an answer at Charlie's because he was sort of a loner, but I was insistent on visiting every trailer in the park before it got dark, so I wanted to try. Most of the trailers had paneling at least a foot high surrounding the bottom to hide the fact that the trailers were up off the ground and make them look more like homes, I suppose. The few cats eating from bowls on the deck scattered underneath the trailer through a bent back panel as I passed the bike chained to the railing. It was outfitted with a basket filled with empty grocery store bags and a horn, and was the nicest thing that Charlie owned. The deck was covered with small dishes of dry food, a couple of large litter boxes, though to be fair, they were pretty clean, various bicycle parts, and heaps of empty grocery and cat food and litter bags. There was a path leading to his sliding glass front door, which was unique as most of our trailers had normal doors with knobs, and was strange to me even then due to the condition of the interior. He had a thin sheet that acted like a curtain hanging in front of it, but that day the sheet was pulled back. The floor inside his trailer was the same as his porch. A path led from where he sat on a dirty green recliner to the front door before branching the opposite direction toward the kitchen. On every other surface that I could see rested bowls of food, litter boxes, and bags, some of them full, most of them empty, and most of these surfaces were made up of homemade carpet-covered contraptions for the cats to climb and scratch. Cats were everywhere. Some ate, some played, but most were asleep. There had to have been at least 40 cats in the parts of the trailer I could see, and many of them were piled on some crumpled blankets piled on the chair. I knocked, and it was as if a bomb had gone off. The cats could see me through the door and hadn't reacted when I stood there, but once I knocked, the pile of crumpled blankets turned out to be Charlie, who had been napping from the looks of it. He threw the blanket back, his eyes wide, screaming, "What? What do you want? Stop it!" The cats were joining in with a chorus of loud meows and hisses. Finally, Charlie focused his gaze on me and glared. He leapt to his feet and ran to the door, dried drool crusting in his beard and spit flying from his mouth. He put his hands on the glass and stared down at me, saying nothing and breathing heavily enough to fog the glass. I was sure he wasn't going to buy anything, but I had to try. The kid who sold the most candy bars got to ride out onto the baseball field and throw the first pitch for our city's national baseball team, and I was determined. After the meowing inside had died down some, I yelled, hoping he would hear me through the glass door. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like, "Good evening, Mr. Charlie. I'm selling chocolate for my baseball team. It's going to a good cause and it's only $1 a bar. Would you like to buy some?" He wiped the fog from the glass and furrowed his eyebrows. For a moment, the crazy looks seemed to fade, and I thought he was actually considering my question. And then he started beating on the glass with his open palms and screaming, "I won't tell you anything! Go away! You can't trick me! Help! Someone call the police! They're trying to kidnap me! Help!" My mom, who had been slowly approaching the deck the entire time, finally grabbed my arm and yanked me away as Charlie slid the glass door back and continued to scream for help. She flipped him off as we speedily walked away, but said nothing to him. He didn't stop until we were 3 trailers away from him. On the plus side, all 3 of those trailers bought more chocolate than any of the others had, probably out of sympathy for my encounter with the Catman. Quick positive side note, I did end up winning the grand prize for my league, but as each league in the city had their own grand prize winner, the league realized they had promised more spots than were available in the limo. They started calling kids and offering cash prizes instead to try and smooth things over amicably. Once I found out the kid who threw the first pitch would be decided by a random raffle at the baseball game, I took the cash instead. I ended up getting a Sega Genesis out of it, so I think I made the right choice. That was my first real up-close encounter with Charlie, and should be considered a baseline for how much worse things got. The whole experience had been overwhelming, and it wasn't until that night, lying in bed and trying to figure out how many more bars I needed to sell to win the grand prize, that I made a sudden correlation that delayed my ability to fall asleep that night. In the brief moment between Charlie opening his door and my mom pulling me away, a familiar smell had escaped his house, as if carried along by his shouts and the loud meowing of his cats. The smell of cat food and bike chain oil and something rotten. The smell of Ed. I think the reason the smell hadn't triggered a connection sooner was because Ed hadn't woken me up for a few months prior to that, and to a 6-year-old, a few months is forever. I'm not going to recall every single visit Ed paid me after those recalled in the first part. I'll just say that most Ed visits fell into one of two scenarios before things got worse. In the beginning, Ed usually woke me up in terrified paralysis with his fingers running through my hair, wheezing in my ear, the smell of his saliva filling my nose until I thought I would be sick. After Ed's fourth visit, the one where I had found the army men with their heads chewed off, I realized he hadn't woken me up at all and wondered if the secret to keeping him happy was by offering my toys as a sacrifice. As much as I hated getting in trouble for ruining my toys, it was worth it to me because I didn't have to see Ed, and most of the toys I ended up sacrificing were crap we got from kids' meals anyway. I also had a little brother to blame things on, so that helped. Yes, like many older brothers, I had a lengthy streak as an unapologetic jerk. There was still the occasional night where I would wake up to him tugging on my hair, and I would still run to my window after the paralysis broke, hoping for a clue of where the hell he came from or went to after. More and more often, I would simply wake up in the morning to find one or two of my toys with their heads chewed off, each of them crusted in his dried, yellow saliva and smelling of cat food, bike oil, and rot. I had started to surround myself with toys and dolls when I slept. There was a pile at the foot of my bed that turned into a line that hugged my wall until it reached my pillows. I always kept my favorites close to me as, ironically, Ed usually went for those at the foot of the bed. Each night, after my mom or dad would tuck me in and turn off the light, I would hug each and every one of them in case Ed destroyed them in the night, as if I were commanding soldiers standing guard instead of talking to pieces of cloth and plastic like a crazy person. As I said, it had been a few months since Ed had done anything more than ruin some of my toys while I slept. 2 weeks after the incident with Charlie, something changed. That was when I finally saw Ed for the first time. I had started sleeping on the top bunk at this point, as James was old enough to sleep on the bottom bunk, though he had bumpers that kept him from rolling out of bed. I was soon to be jealous of those baby bumpers. This visit was different. His cracked wheezing woke me up as usual, but it was distant. As I awoke, I was surprised that I was able to move, and, more importantly, to breathe normally. I have never again experienced that paralysis or feeling of swallowing a skin-covered balloon that I described before, as if we had moved beyond the point where that was necessary. I still expected the paralysis to strike at any moment, so I kept my eyes closed and remained still. The wheezing grew deep and started to sound more like a growl, and then I felt his long fingers running along my shins and feet and was paralyzed not by Ed, but by terror. The reason the wheezing sounded far away is because he wasn't in his usual perch behind my head. I suppressed my initial instinct of childlike curiosity and squeezed my eyes tightly closed. Ed had always been behind my head, and there had always been some sort of safety in not knowing. If I opened my eyes, I wouldn't see a shadowy figure leaping from my window or long fingertips out of my peripherals. If I opened my eyes, I would be face to face with my worst nightmare. He started to stroke both of my shins, and I squeezed my eyes closed even tighter, causing them to ache. The stroking turned more and more frantic before ceasing altogether, and after a moment, I loosened the iron squeeze on my eyelids before the ache turned into pain. Though the wheezing had stopped, I promised myself I wouldn't open my eyes until I heard the thump and patter of his feet that signaled his exit. After a long time, I convinced myself to be brave and slowly opened my eyes, aiming them in the direction of my feet, preparing for the worst. There was nothing there but a disheveled pile of toys. I had been holding my breath along with my eyelids, and, as soon as I saw Ed had disappeared, I let out a long exhale and let my head sink back into my pillow, relieved. As soon as my gaze moved from my feet to the ceiling above me, the tail end of that long exhale turned into a whimpered sort of scream. Kneeling behind my head, staring down at me with his face inches from my own, was the horrific and smiling face of Ed the Head Eater. I could feel the warm breath slipping through his sharp teeth pouring over my face. I took small, shallow breaths through my nose, unable to scream even if I wanted to, and could taste the cat food and death on the back of my tongue. I wanted nothing more than to close my eyes again and pretend I had never seen that monstrous face, but I knew that his face would just be painted on the back of my eyelids if I did, and that seemed worse to me. The wheezing, I found out, was not coming through his mouth, but through the slit nostrils resting just above it. The nostrils joined in the middle of his face and split his head with the thin line. The dry, cracked part of the wheezing came from behind that line with each breath, and the edges vibrated like a pair of closed lips having wet air forced through them. Unable to look away and unwilling to close my eyes, I threw myself sideways to escape his looming face. I finally heard the thump that signified safety, only this time the thump came from my own body slamming into the floor as I fell from the top bunk and bumped my head. Thankfully, since the floor was hollow, it wasn't too painful, but I cried out in pain anyway. In my daze, I also heard the pattering of feet, but they were coming toward me instead of away from me, and I sat up with a jolt, sure that Ed was finally done toying with me and ready to eat my head in lieu of the meager sacrifices I had been leaving him. Light flooded the bedroom, and I realized the pattering wasn't Ed's, but my mother's. My falling hadn't woken James up, but the light and my mother shrieking, "Are you all right?" did, causing his young, high-pitched warbles to join the confusing chorus my brain was trying to make sense of. My mom picked me up and held me close, turning me in such a way that I was able to see the window. Outside of it, I saw his face in the dark, one long finger hovering in front of his mouth to demand my silence, and then Ed was gone. The next day, my mom had a neighbor come over, and they reorganized the room. The bunks were separated, and my own was put next to the window. I wanted to protest, but I could think of nothing to say that made sense, and I didn't want to upset her after the night before. I had told my mom that I had fallen out of bed when trying to kick the covers off because I had gotten hot, so she surprised me later that day with a fan to keep me cool at night. I've slept with a fan pointed on me ever since, no matter the weather or the complaints from significant others. Though up until I started writing this, I always said it was from my body temperature running hot instead of blocking out the wheezing sound of doom from a head-eating monster. My mother attributes it to a feeling of maternal comfort, but that's not the case. Ed has found far more creative ways to wake me up over the years, but the fan noise has kept me from having to hear that dreadful wheeze in the night. I have never forgotten what it sounds like, but I haven't had to hear it since then, so small victories, I guess. A few years ago, I started learning how to draw. I'm not great at it, but I've always been fascinated by scary things, probably because of Ed, and one day I got the wild idea to draw that face I saw looming over me so many years ago. To this day, it's the first and only time something has translated from my mind to paper with perfect clarity. Shortly after that night is when Charlie stopped screaming for help from his deck and started knocking on doors and car windows to ask for answers from anybody who would listen. From that point on, it was rare that you would see him without a grocery bag in his hand. Unlike those he kept lying around his trailer, these were always full. The bags were never empty, like I said, but I only saw the contents once while my mom and I were walking home from the bus stop after an early release day. I only remember that because we always got ice cream from the corner store on early release days. The corner store was called Frank's, and it was just outside of the trailer park. After we saw what Charlie carried around in his grocery bag, my mom pulled me away so hard and fast that I dropped my ice cream. Charlie had approached us that day asking for help, standing in our way and making it difficult to pass without being openly dismissive. My mom succumbed that day, I suppose hoping that humoring him would prevent him from bothering us in the future. "It's taking them and hurting them. What is it? I have to know before it gets me too. It's after me." "I don't know who they are, Charlie. I'm sorry." Can we please get by now?" "Not they," he screamed. "It! Damn it, woman, what kind of they would do this?" That's when he dumped the contents of the bag onto the ground in front of us. The white fur was caked with dried, dark brown blood and something crusty and yellow. The kitten couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. There were scratches on its body, but the most noticeable thing about the poor dead animal was the head. It no longer had one. My mom let out a high-pitched scream as she grabbed me and ran, causing me to drop the ice cream. All the while, Charlie screamed after us, "I'm next! You're next! Help me, please!" Our trailer was only a block away, so as my mom unlocked the door, I looked back and saw Charlie picking the dead kitten up by the tail and lowering it into his bag, shaking his head in disbelief. I also saw him reach for the fallen ice cream as my mom pulled me through the door. Honestly, while my mom raved for an hour about how I was never to talk to him or go near his house and called every person she could think of to gossip in a manic voice stifled only by chain smoking, I was just mad that Charlie had gotten my ice cream. Charlie was afraid of it without even knowing what it was. But I knew because it had been staring down at me weeks before, smiling at me with the same sharp teeth that had left the kitten headless in the first place. I was already afraid of it, and my mother mistook my complacency in the face of familiar fear with shock. I didn't think anything would be able to scare me again. In what would prove to be my longest period of consistent encounters, Ed spent the next 3 years proving me wrong.